No, he has to speak on the mic. Please ask him to speak on the mic. Yep.
I want to start with by thanking Eric
Quero começar
Filinto
agradecendo
and
Eric
all of our
Filinto
hosts
e
here.
todos os
They've been
nossos
remarkably gracious. This is my second
pessoas que
time
nos
in Brazil.
receberam aqui. É a segunda vez que venho ao Brasil. Comecei em 2004.
What I said to everyone, both there and when I
E eu
came home,
disse para
was
todos
that the
quando eu voltei
Brazilians
para
were
casa que os
amazingly
brasileiros
hospitable
foram
people, and I found that to be
acolhedores.
true
Eu
this
descobri
visit
que isso é
as well.
verdadeiro
So I'm
também
looking
nesta
forward
visita.
to the rest of
Então,
the conference in Salvador and Fortaleza. Let me, is this okay, Mike-wise? Let me also say that at one point in my career, I made the undergraduate teaching schedules for my department, and one of my colleagues always insisted that he not be scheduled at 11 o'clock in the morning, because he said at a certain time near the end of his class, his students would start looking at him, realizing that he was the only thing standing between them and lunch, and he found it was hard to get their attention. Well, I think one thing worse than that might be speaking 2 hours after having eaten a lunch full of feijoada. So I hope that people have enough energy and life to pay attention to this talk. The talk this is really two pieces coming together. It's a kind of hybrid talk. Media shock part is excerpted from a longer piece that I'm hoping to finish and get off somewhere relatively soon, so I'm only giving a portion of that. But I also have a little introduction called On Mediation that is really a kind of first attempt at sort of being maybe the germ of a piece that I would like to work on next, that develops more theoretically or even philosophically the idea of mediation and the ontology of mediation. And so I thought I would try this out here in this audience as well, just to get myself going on that. So that's very sort of premature in a lot of respects, but I thought it would be useful to do. The other thing to say is that, well, I've added to the subtitle, The Secret Life of Mediation. In a sense, what I'm trying to do here, and I think in many respects in a lot of my work, is make visible, as Latour said, or make public, the aspect of mediation that often remains secret. Okay, so I think I will sit and see how this goes. We good? Let's see. Okay, the first section is called On Mediation. Mediation has become one of the central intellectual problems of the 21st century. The question of mediation has come to the forefront in part because of the extraordinary technological development in the late 20th and 21st centuries, the rampant proliferation of digital media technologies that often goes under the name of mediatization. In addition to the widespread theorizing about media prompted by the intense mediatization of the past several decades, the concept of mediation itself has increasingly come to the fore, particularly in the wake of recent and not so recent critiques of the dualism of the Western philosophical tradition that make up what I've called the non-human turn in 21st century studies, but also which has gone more recently under the name of correlationism. In developing the concept of media shock, I make two related but independent arguments here. One about the function of mediation in the present historical moment, and another about the theoretical or ontological status of mediation in Western thought. Historically, I offer the concept of media shock to describe some of the ways in which media and media technologies have operated and continue to operate in the 21st century. Theoretically, I'm interested in the affective and the ontological status of mediation, both how mediation operates effectively prior to and in some sense independent of thought, to make possible individual and collective moods or structures of feeling among assemblages of humans and non-humans, and I'm also interested in how mediation operates physically as an object in the world to impact humans and non-humans alike. I've been thinking and writing about the history and theory of mediation for nearly 20 years, most notably in my work on the logics of mediation in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. But I have throughout this work also been concerned with thinking through in various and partial ways the ontological status of mediation. In the essay Remediation, from which the book was later developed, which Bolter and I published in the 1996 volume of Configurations, we wrote that media function as objects within the world, within systems of linguistic, cultural, social, and economic exchange. Later in the same part of the essay, we further elaborated the ontology of mediation. And here's a quote from that essay. As we know from a visit to any traditional museum, the space between viewer and canvas is controlled, institutionalized, and policed as a special, real kind of space, which people walk around or wait before entering. And, of course, all this conference, you've seen that happen as people have ducked under the camera that's at the back of the hall. In our own time, the colonization of museum space has been extended to the space between a photographer or videographer and the object of her mediating technology. When a tourist is taking a photograph or making a video, for example, we treat the line of sight between the camera and the object as if it were a real obstruction. We walk around it, bend under it, or wait until it is gone. We make these gestures not only out of politeness, but also to acknowledge the reality of the act of mediation that we are witnessing. In this case, the act of mediation functions in a system of pedestrian traffic circulation like a tree, a wire, or a traffic light, which is also an act of mediation whose reality we acknowledge. Mediations are real not only because the objects produced, photos, videos, films, paintings, CD-ROMs, etc., this was 1996, so CD-ROMs sneak in, circulate in the real world, but also because the act of mediation itself functions as a Latourian hybrid and is treated much like a physical object. Some of the rhetorical qualifications in this passage, as in much of the book Remediation, derive from the compromises of co-authorship. My own characterization of the reality of mediation was and continues to be more direct. Thus, in the notes on method, in the preface to my 2010 book, Premediation, that's not forthcoming, actually was released in 2010, I gloss the passage above as follows, and a quote from that book. I also operate in this book from the assumption that media are objects in the world no different in kind from any other. Even more strongly, I treat mediation itself as an object, a point made in remediation in terms of the ways in which people would, for example, routinely walk around or pause between the line of mediation between a photographer or videographer and her subject, just as they might walk around a wire stretched across their path or wait at a traffic light. In treating media and mediation as objects within the world, I follow Bruno Latour's distinction between intermediaries and mediators, in which mediators are not neutral means of transmission, but actively involved in changing whatever they mediate. Mediation operates through what Latour characterizes as translation, not by neutrally reproducing meaning or information, but by actively transforming conceptual and affective states. In this talk, I deploy the concept of media shock to exemplify how media and mediation operate within the world as objects no different from any other. This concept of mediation departs from the way it has traditionally been used in Western thought, at least since Kant and Hegel, but more likely back to Aristotle. Although as a literary critic turned media theorist, I don't feel entirely confident making definitive assertions about the history of the Western philosophical tradition. Nonetheless, I want to challenge the way in which mediation has been defined and deployed conventionally as a secondary, or sometimes, for someone like Peirce, like a tertiary concept or category. The way mediation is deployed as something that enters the scene belatedly after the world has already been divided up into subjects and objects, humans and non-humans, representation and reality. In these traditional accounts, mediation has been seen to come between, in the middle of, already preformed, pre-existent subjects or objects, actants or entities. Especially in post-Hegelian Marxian thought, mediation has been seen as epistemological or ideological, as something that is opposed to immediacy, as what might be called an agent of correlation, which filters, constrains, or distorts an immediate perception or knowledge of or engagement with the world. Mediation has most often been understood in terms of logics of representation, hermeneutics, or ideology, as preventing or making impossible the direct and immediate relation with the world, which Brian Masumi insists upon as a fundamental component of human and non-human experience. Although Masumi himself takes issue with the concept of mediation, I want to suggest that we understand mediation itself as a place to begin. Mediation needs to be understood as an ontological rather than an epistemological category. Mediation should be understood not as standing between preformed subjects, objects, actants, or entities, but as the process or action or event that generates or provides the conditions for the emergence of subject and objects, for the individuation of entities within the world. Mediation is not opposed to immediacy, but rather is itself immediate. It names the immediacy of middleness in which we already find ourselves. In developing the concept of media shock, I operate from a sense that where we find ourselves, both at the beginning of the 21st century and in human and non-human history more generally, is immediately in the middle, in mediation itself. And as I want to develop this argument, I want to situate this in a tradition that goes back in American thought, back to the transcendentalists, particularly Emerson and Thoreau, both of whom, especially Emerson, were important influences on William James, and I would argue Emerson was an important influence on Whitehead, although Whitehead is fairly dismissive of Emerson in the one or two references that I've found him making. Next section is called premediation, and if I can figure out how to work this. The bottom here. No. Oh, right. This is a problem. I moved my sections around, so we'll stay there. Okay. In premediation, I trace a shift in cultural logics of mediation from a focus on the present and recent past, which predominated in the latter decades of the 20th century, to an increasing focus on the future, which has come to predominate at the beginning of the 21st century. Taking up the logics and practices of mediation circulating through the United States in the period after 9/11, I trace the emergence, or more accurately, the intensification of a logic of premediation in the 21st century, especially in America. Although premediation predates... No, I'm fine. Although premediation predates the event of 9/11, it became plainly evident in the run-up to the Iraq War in 2002 and 2003. Premediation is in some respects a counterpart to the concept of remediation that Jay Bolter and I developed in the late 90s to make sense of the contradictory logics and practices of mediation circulating at the end of the previous millennium. Premediation does not displace remediation, but deploys it in different aesthetic, socio-technical, or political formations. The double logic of remediation still obtains, but its conflicting media logics are formally different. Another way to say this is, premediation can be seen to describe the temporal and affective formation of today's socially networked society. Where remediation spoke to the more individualized, networked model of immediacy and hypermediacy that prevailed in the cyberculture of the 80s and 90s, premediation speaks to the anticipatory temporality of the 21st century, the way in which we are always already moving through social networks that are premediated into the future. Premediation addresses how we use our networked media to mobilize ourselves and others, human and non-human, so that we come together and disperse in heterogeneous temporal and spatial events, whether online via Facebook or Twitter, or in geographical space through the linking of mobile technologies with GPS and other spatial technologies. In the 80s and 90s, the temporal focus of new media was largely on the possibilities of digital immediacy. In the 21st century, the affective and temporal focus of our socially networked media is increasingly on futurity or anticipation, on what is to come, where we are to go, when we are to meet. Such temporal shifts are never totalizing. We're always operating within competing temporalities. People in the 21st century are still interested in immediacy or the now, just as in the last decades of the 20th century, new digital media technologies brought into play new imaginings of the future, new interest in alternative, future-oriented temporalities. But what remains constant throughout history is that predominant affective and temporal formations are connected with predominant technical and medial formations. And this is sort of the McLuhan aspect, as much of this, I think, connects with McLuhan's work. Thus, the obsessive digitization of all prior media forms in the late 20th century fostered an orientation towards renewing the past, which resulted in the nearly universal claims of the newness of digital media. In the 21st century, the temporality of premediation is also connected to the predominant forms of technical mediation, which at the start of the second decade of the 21st century, I would maintain, are mobile socially networked media and the big data that emerge from and underlie these distributed networks. These media are not primarily concerned either with the now or with the new, or insofar as they are, they're concerned with them chiefly as they will be replaced or succeeded by the next now, or the next new status update, tweet, or text. The affective temporality of premediation in the 21st century is the temporality of anticipation, in which our mobile socially networked media work together to produce, satisfy, and maintain individual and collective affective states of anticipation towards a potential, virtual, and thereby already real futurity. Now that's a really dense and compact summary of the argument of premediation. So let me just briefly say a little bit more of what I mean. The argument came about in the run-up to the Iraq War, when I noticed that in the media, what was happening is that the war in Iraq was being played out in 2002 and 2003 before it ever happened. It was being pre-mediated. And so you watched CNN in the United States, and what you saw was exactly what you would see after the war happened. You would see a retired general sitting next to Wolf Blitzer or whatever reporter, Anderson Cooper. You would see pictures, videos of war, of various scenarios, and you would have them play out the variety of possible scenarios that might happen. What people may not remember from about 10 years ago is some people thought it would be really fast. We'd go into Iraq and we'd be out in a month. Other people thought it would be a, block by block, house by house battle. Other people thought we'd come in from the south or from the north. And for all of these scenarios, what we saw in the media was you'd get the same visuals. You'd have maps with the arrows showing the armies coming in. You'd get video from previous wars that would illustrate this and so forth, so that the war was, we experienced the war effectively before it ever happened. And when the war finally did happen, when Bush finally invaded Iraq, there was a lot less uproar than there might have been because people had already been kind of worn down. At the same time that this was happening, the movie Minority Report came out, and other things like this happened. And there was a kind of, I began to see a kind of pattern of a logic of trying to preempt or prevent dangerous activities, murders in Minority Report, or terrorist attacks in the U.S. before they happen. So this logic of preemption is a big part of this logic of premediation. What's happened since then, and I think increasingly with our social media, all of which have developed after 9/11, all of these socially networked media, is that we now have a kind of media temporality that is all about just leaning forward into the future. So when you post a Facebook status update, what you're posting it for is not for the update itself. You're posting it because you want someone to like it, or you want a comment, or you want it to be shared. When you post something on Twitter, it's the game of Twitter is not the tweet itself. The game is the retweeting, the mentioning, and so forth. And the media themselves build into the format and interface of the media this very opportunity. In fact, the sort of premediation of response happens before the response does. So on my Facebook page, when Steve has a status update, right below it is like option, is the comment box, and my picture next to the comment box. So my response is premediated before it happens. So all of these social media, and then the way young people especially use text messages and so forth, they're mostly about, or very often about, organizing things. Where are you? Where will you be? Let's meet here at a certain time, and so forth. And other of our media work this way too. Anyway, there's a lot more to the argument, but it gives you an idea, I think, of what I'm trying to get at. Okay, the next section then is called media shock. More than a decade after 9/11, much of the networked world remains in an acute state of media shock. In many respects, this media shock follows from the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and more crucially, from the overwhelming aftershocks that rumbled through the global economic and securitization apparatuses and across print, televisual, and networked media. But media shock pre-existed 9/11 and has been intensified, transformed, and reinitiated many times in the 21st century, most recently in the Euro crisis raging across the EU. Indeed, media today thrive on crisis, shock, and disaster. At the first sign of meteorological turmoil, social unrest, financial turbulence, or national cataclysm, print, televisual, and network news media shift into crisis mode, generating on-the-ground reports, live updates, multiple commentaries, and breaking news. In the U.S., CNN pioneered the 24/7 crisis mode in global cable news as far back as the 1980s, but the media's thirst for crisis, its obsession with remediating disaster and premediating shock, has intensified in the 21st century, jump-started by the events of 9/11, but escalating in the subsequent decade. With the exception of pre-planned events like the Olympics or World Cup, national elections, or award ceremonies, the most intensive media coverage today invariably occurs in response to crises or disasters that operate according to their own temporality. Whether dramatic falls on the world's financial markets, hurricanes, earthquakes, volcanoes, or tsunamis, geotechnical accidents like mine explosions, oil leaks, floods, or nuclear meltdowns, violent terrorist acts like suicide bombings, assassinations, or hijackings, or political upheavals like strikes, demonstrations, occupations, or riots. While one might contend that covering such unexpected events is what news is supposed to do and has always done, what's distinctive about this proliferation of crisis mediation is that it operates according to a different temporality, with a different periodicity than the news has historically followed. Contemporary media shocks are not only felt in the formal news media, but reverberate throughout informal participatory media as well. Where print and televisual news media operate according to a periodic rhythm of daily mediation, informal media operate according to an irregular and often quite uneven temporal pace. Thus, 21st century catastrophes and disasters not only set national, local, and international news organizations into immediate action, but are felt even more quickly in the world of social media. as Twitter streams, Facebook feeds, YouTube videos, digital photos, emails, blogs, and instant messages multiply exponentially in the aftermath of such events and focus as much on what is to come as on what has already happened. So whenever there's an event like this, the news is about what the consequences are going to be, what the result's going to be, and I'll lay this out a little bit in relation to the the earthquake in March 11. I offer the concept of media shock, then, as a way to try to make sense of the mood or atmosphere of shock or crisis that media in the 21st century work simultaneously to create and to contain. So part of my argument is that the media, news media especially, but also informal media, unsettle us with fears of crisis and of what the consequences of crises will be, climate change, etc., for example, but that our social media relations work to reassure us, so that when we log on and we reconnect with our social networks, there's a feeling of security or calmness or, oh, okay, we're back. And any of you know who leave the house without your mobile, or when you get to your hotel and your wireless doesn't work, that creates a little bit of anxiety or uncertainty, because those media are working to kind of keep us calm in a way. And so these two parts of the media, of the sort of global media world, are working together in this way to kind of destabilize us and then reassure us, both of which have the aim of keeping us connected and attached to our media devices. So building on my recent work on premediation, I see media shock as participating in the critique of representation that has been intensifying in cultural, political, and media theory over the past couple of decades. Thus, while I take as a point of departure the ways that media represent and remediate shock, I'm more concerned with how they produce, intensify, and modulate the affectivity of shock, both individually and collectively, among humans and non-humans alike. In the fuller version of this piece, I outline some of the ways that media shock has manifested itself historically, especially in the 20th century. Today, I'll only focus on the beginning of the 21st century and look at the, in particular as an example, and only partially as an example, on the Sendai quake. I'll briefly then take this case up in order to show how media have begun to let's see, start this over. I'll briefly take up an exemplary case of this connection between the mediation of disasters or crises and the affectivity of disaster or shock that they produce, modulate, amplify, and shape. Specifically, I'll take up the remediation and premediation of the Japanese earthquake and tsunami in March 2011 and the still ongoing consequences which have begun to manifest themselves in a very tangible material fashion in the debris that is now finding its way to the shores and barrier islands of the Pacific coast of North America. And those are cars and other ships, other kinds of things that have made their way across from the aftershock, or from the quake. I move among four different senses of the concept of media shock. First, the preoccupation of news media with crisis and disaster. Second, the way media physically shock the human system as a bioorganism, how media materially alter the human bodily sensorium. Third, how media impact social patterns or truths or habits, changing public norms or collective affective formations in anticipation of and in response to changing material and medial conditions. And fourth, how, like earthquakes or other natural disasters, media produce geophysical, geopolitical, and geoaffective shocks or impacts upon the global assemblage of humans and non-humans, of social, technical, and natural actants that constitute the world in the 21st century. In each of these aspects, I emphasize the affectivity of our media themselves and their relation to the affectivity of natural or technical disasters or crises. I also explore the ontological status of such geotechnical media events, which are produced neither by nature, society, or technology, but which emerge as complex assemblages, new kinds of events or objects, or actants in the world that are related to, but not finally reducible to, the mediatization brought about by the explosion of new information and media technologies in the past few decades. Okay, so the last section then will be on Media Shock Japan. As I said, it's a shortened version of the longer piece. In addition to modulating public affect or mood, media also function to regulate the temporality of national, state, or diasporic communities, marking and archiving the regular periodic functioning of cultural, social, economic, and political institutions. I offer the concept of media shock as an attempt to make sense of how media operate during aperiodic events of disaster or crisis that unfold according to their own periodicity rather than at regularly scheduled times. In premediation, I argue that media function as agents of governmentality in the 21st century, through the operations of mediality. It's important, therefore, to understand how media govern what Foucault calls, in his essay Governmentality, this complex of men and things, not only during business as usual, but more crucially during moments of disaster or crisis. Or perhaps put differently, we need to account for how our mass, networked, and distributed media attempt to govern disasters or crises by regulating such aperiodic events through strategies of remediation and premediation. Media shock shapes or enables particular individual and collective affective formations which keep people attached to social media, television, or the internet, both through intensifying the affective bond with their technical media devices. And Simone was talking about those very bonds in her talk in terms of the bond people have for vinyl and so forth, and through how the remediation and premediation of shock or disaster simultaneously makes people feel anxious and reassures them, keeps them anticipating the future so that they continue to return to their social media networks and devices, to television, online news sources, and so forth. That's the slide I missed. If we think in terms of a more complex global environment of affective technologies, we can begin to understand how a geotechnical media event like the 2011 Japanese earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown could have had a physical impact on the reality of our mediatic system. Not only did the Sendai earthquake produce numerous aftershocks in the Earth's crust, generate several tsunamis, and cause serious damage in the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant, but it also worked to generate affective shocks in the mediatic system, shocks whose reality was registered in all kinds of different media effects. On Twitter, and that's a map recording the number of Twitter feeds in various parts of Japan in the days following the quake, and Facebook, email, text, blogs, radio, TV, print, and so forth. In claiming that the Sendai quake generated mediatic as well as seismic aftershocks, I'm not simply being metaphorical, but arguing that these media aftershocks were produced by the quake and its aftermath in just the same way that tsunamis, floods, and seismic aftershocks were, and that the intensification and amplification of our media systems was registered in the mediatic infrastructure in just the same way that they were registered by the Japanese communication, transportation, and energy infrastructures. One way to unpack how the Sendai earthquake generated media aftershocks through a direct chain of inscription and translation, for example, would be to think in terms of Bruno Latour's description of the meteorological chain that operated in the circulation of reference from the Brazilian rainforest to the pages of a scientific journal or scientific studies monograph. The seismic waves produced by the quake are registered by seismometers, which are connected to seismographic instruments that translate these seismic waves into inscriptions that can be read by scientists, compared with other seismographs, and transmitted through network communication infrastructure to academic, governmental, and media institutions. Such media aftershocks are then incorporated into news reports in print, televisual, and network media, as well as informal media, connected back through a meteorological chain of reference to the shaking of the earth produced by the subduction of the Pacific plate. So I'm trying to suggest that there's a kind of series of aftershocks not only measured in the Earth, for example, or demonstrated in the damage it's done in Japan and its infrastructures and so forth, but that is also then affects and creates this activity in the mediatic system. In sketching out this sequence of media transmission, I don't mean to suggest that these media shocks are simply passive responses to the quake and its aftermath, nor do I want to deny either the agency of the news media in remediating and premediating these disasters, or the agency of the individuals who tweeted, texted, emailed, flickered, or updated their status, Facebook status, any more than the agency of the news reports, tweets, texts, emails, photos, or status updates themselves. Our mediatic system is a complex assemblage of state, corporate, and informal media, of technical infrastructure, finance capital, and affective labor, of bodies, screens, and devices. Following the work of Latour, Jane Bennett, and others on the agency of assemblages, I understand mediatic agency, like all human and non-human agency, as distributed and complex, interwoven among humans and non-humans, organic and technical actants and networks. In linking the media aftershocks with those in the geosphere or in the Japanese and global post-industrial infrastructure, what I'm trying to do is bring into focus both the ways in which the media system itself is physically impacted by crises like these, and how media function as active translators and mediators of these physical shocks, how they work to transform, modulate, and remediate the shock of geophysical disaster into new media formations which themselves work to modulate individual and collective affectivities of people and things across a widely networked and hyper-mediated world. This temporality through which global media cover catastrophes like this has now become increasingly familiar, as with all 20th and 21st century crises. You get a kind of double logic of remediation that combines the televisual immediacy of live audio, video, and graphics with the hypermediacy of fragmented and multiplied mediation on the screens of our cable news networks. In the onslaught of events like these, global cable news networks are often the first responders, conveying the immediacy of the catastrophe through images of what might be understood as disaster porn, intensified through the hypermediacy of its multiple remediation. In the last few years, the double logic of remediation through which our globally networked televisual media have operated since the last decades of the 20th century has been supplemented by the double logic of social media networks, in which Twitter, streams, Facebook updates, and so forth combine a desire for the premediacy of anticipation with the hypermediacy of a media environment that overwhelms us with the force and scope of its flows. In the disastrous aftermath of the Japanese quake and tsunami, these flows work something like media aftershocks caused by the initial quake. Much as the first quake generated huge tsunami waves and multiple aftershocks, it also generated media waves and shocks that reverberated through global print, televisual, and socially networked news media. And of course, the earthquake generated numerous other aftershocks, producing additional smaller quakes as well as generating additional shocks in economic, social, cultural, technical, and economic systems. Not only, as scientists informed us, did the quake shift the mantle of the Earth and the axis of the Earth's spin, but it altered the technical and geopolitical media axis as well. So if this is indeed the case, we should be able to find ways to measure the aftershocks of the quake, not only in terms of seismic activity, but in terms of the activity of markets, media, nation-states, and individual lives. And here's a slide from an attempt by a Spanish research group to measure the media impact on Japanese cities. In measuring these aftershocks, then, we can see the geophysical or natural effects of the quakes that are the consequences of these events. All of these events are part of the same complex geopolitical assemblage. On the day of the quake, for example, CNN showed a graphic which compared the Richter scale measurement of seismic activity leading up to and beyond the Sendai quake with the minute-by-minute measurement of financial activity on the Nikkei market, dramatizing graphically the way in which the quake could be measured both seismically and economically on the Richter and on the Nikkei scale. And I haven't found that graphic that I saw on CNN, but here are the two scales juxtaposed, and what happens is as soon as, or almost as soon as the quake starts, or just thereafter, the Nikkei just drops. Other similar measurements of activity in terms of TV viewers, tweets, emails, texts, and Facebook updates would likewise produce interesting evidence of the ontological continuity among natural, political, technical, and mediatic events. So I've got two more paragraphs. Maybe I've got three. Okay. The one example that I wanted to talk about. Okay, then I'm good. In the 21st century, the initial frenzied remediation of global crises like those produced by the March 11th Sendai quake is only the first stage of such media disasters. In print, televisual, and socially networked news media, the immediate explosion of news reports detailing what happened are now increasingly accompanied and inevitably followed by multiple premediations of what might happen as a result of the initial disaster. In the aftermath of the Sendai quake, for example, premediation in especially U.S. media began most intensively with coverage of the tsunami generated by the quake. In the hours immediately following the quake, media coverage in the United States turned increasingly from Japan and towards the tracking of the tsunami wave's progress east across the Pacific Ocean, first towards Hawaii and then the North American Pacific coast. The multiple premediations of tsunami watches and warnings, and this was all over the news in the hours after the quake in the U.S., hit the shores of the Hawaiian Islands. The warnings and premediations hit the shores of the Hawaiian Islands and the Pacific coast of the U.S. well before and with much greater intensity than the wave ever did. The tsunami was a non-event in Hawaii or in the Pacific coast, but the media tsunami that followed, the premediation of the tsunami, was extremely intense and arrived much more quickly. In the weeks following the earthquake, both the damage that had been done to the reactor's cooling system and the dangers produced by the partial meltdown of the radioactive core produced numerous premediations in the formal and informal U.S. news media, not only about the dangers to the Japanese people, but more pressingly about potential dangers to the U.S. from nuclear fallout or other radiological consequences. What was most interesting about these premediations was how they almost invariably treated reports on the physical spread of radiation as interchangeable with and indistinguishable from concerns about the affective fallout of the disaster, particularly in reporting on fears from potential radioactive fallout. So in the longer version of this talk, I have several examples of how the U.S. news media would simultaneously report that there was no threat from radiation, and in the very same story report that fears of such threats were spreading and intensifying. So they discovered, for example, little traces of radiation in the milk in the western states of the U.S., which apparently came from fallout on the grass that the cows were grazing on. The news report factually said this level of radiation is much lower than the background radiation that people are exposed to every day, but the news story had at the bottom, throughout its 2.5-minute extent, radiation fears spread across the United States. So the radiation fears, the affective response, is monitored and spreading, even at the same time that they're telling us that, factually, there's nothing to worry about. In the week following the quake, one could find numerous examples of such discontinuities among print, televisual, and network news. Examples significant not for their false consciousness, media cynicism, cynicism or bad faith, although those might all have been involved, but I think rather for their indication of the competing and often inconsistent aims of media in the 21st century. In addition to monitoring what's going on in the world, the role of the news media today now also includes monitoring and shaping how the world is feeling. Media shock suggests that we should be able to quantify or otherwise measure the affective consequences of the disaster just like we could its physiological or radiological consequences. Insofar as we can measure the aftershocks of earthquakes or the effects of tsunamis or the concentrations of oil on shores or in volumes of water, so we should be able to measure the mediatic aftershocks of such events through the volume of tweets or Facebook postings or blogs or cable news updates or other media events. In the 21st century, news media report both on facts, actions, and events, the traditional role of the news media, and on emotion, affect, or mood, which is increasingly becoming a crucial part of the media's role. The mediality of this latter role is not only about monitoring or reporting on public mood or affect, but also and perhaps more strongly about shaping and modulating that mood, which is particularly evident in the way that news media report on affect and emotion with the same terminology, the same rhetorical conceits, and the same metaphors they use to report on disasters and other geopolitical events. Media shock works both to mobilize affect and to immobilize action. To preserve the structures and periodic functioning of 21st century mediatic capitalism, even in the face of aperiodic crises and disasters that threaten to disrupt that structural periodicity. And in so doing, media shock operates simultaneously in a historically distinct manner specific to the human and non-human formations of the 21st century, and according to an ontology of the immediacy of mediation that has a trans-historical but not a transcendental character. And in the longer version, I go on to talk about a little bit more about these kinds of new events, like nuclear meltdown, like climate change, like massive flooding and things like that, all of which cannot be called, I mean, they're classic sort of Latourian quasi-objects. They can't be called natural exactly because they involve technological impacts as well. They can't be called technological exactly because they involve natural systems, and all of them operate according to a temporality which we don't control. So that climate change, has its own, it's in motion. It's got its own temporal activity. We can try to do some things about it. We can try to slow it down, or we can try to reduce the pace by which it's happening, but these new events have their own kind of periodicity or temporality. Same thing, even things like the stock market operate in that way. So I spend some time talking about that, and also about how because of the sort of creation of huge multinational corporations like General Electric, which is the parent company of the national broadcasting company, NBC, in the United States, and one of the largest corporations in the world, that the separation, there's no separation between media and crises and disasters like this. General Electric manufactured the nuclear reactors that malfunctioned in Japan, and manufacture the reactors at 23 other, I think, nuclear power plants in the world. So, and they're such a large company that it's really impossible to imagine any crisis or disaster that is not part of this new kind of mega entity, mega conglomerate like General Electric. So that mediation is no longer in that sense as well, could no longer be seen as something that happens separate from the real, right? I mean, there's no separation between mediation and reality. The two are now increasingly intertwined, not only in a philosophical sense, in the way that people like Graham Harman, Steve Shavero, and Bruno Latour and others have been talking about for a long time, but they're also inseparable on the ground in a kind of material, economic, socio-technical sense as well, inseparable in ways that I think wasn't always the case, and that are actually distinct in the 21st century. Thanks very much.
stay here, Richard. It's okay. It's fine.
Thank you, Richard. Então, passo a palavra ao Vinícius.